Okay, hello. Welcome to part three of our interview with Mr. Dave Seeman, a test pilot who was instrumental in bringing the E-2 and C-2 aircraft to the fleet. In our previous segments of this VAW-VRC Foundation Oral History Project, we've seen how Dave entered the world of aviation, his early days as a fleet pilot, and now we've reached the point where Dave is going to work for Grumman as a test pilot. And his work involves the very, very initial days of the E-2 aircraft. So Dave, we're fascinated to hear what that was like and the challenges and the triumphs that you had in that endeavor. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We're in 1950, 55, 56. We have gone through our E1, which was taking a TF, actually is what you would know as what you know now as a C1, a development of the S2, and turned that into the Stoof with a roof. And the E1 APS 20 basic radar early warning airplane, and I wound up doing a lot of work on it and doing some of the electronic work on it because of the fact that I was S2 qualified from my 2 years at flying with Bar Bethpage. The time frame that we're doing this at, and the E2 coming along, was a very stressful and a very crowded period of time for the Grumman Corporation and from our flight test setup. Our chief pilot at the time was a guy by the name of Fred Rowley, and Fred had been one of the well, he was an engineer, of course, was an engineer, and but he also was one of the lead pilots at the Fairchild Aviation Corporation. So his background basically was in light transport aircraft, but he had also done some of the work on the F9, F6, and he had a good background. But he got us all together, and we were kind of a motley crew of probably eight engineering pilots. And he said, hey, we've got some interesting things ahead of us. We're bidding on the A6. We've still got F9, F8T stuff to do. We're going to do a Gulfstream. We're going to do a commercial aircraft. We've got this E2, which is an airplane that will replace the E1 in the fleet, but it's going to do more than replace it. What they have in mind for it is quite a bit more complex than the E1 ever thought of being, and we're going to have to get to work, and we're going to have to take as much ability as you have to cross fly and cross develop airplanes that are rather dissimilar in many ways in their flying qualities and in their purposes. And very fortunately, I think we had a group that could do that. Now, in the E2, there were 4 of us that were primarily involved initially with it. Carl Alber was the chief pilot at that time. Fred Rowley was the director of flight test, and he's the one who made the comments that, hey, we got a big load ahead, and we're going to have to be versatile. The prime project pilot on the airplane was Tommy Attridge, and Tom had done a tremendous job on developing the S2E or S2F3, and he was an ex-F6F wartime pilot, and he he is the guy that is best known in naval aviation annals as the man who shot himself down in an F-11F by running into his own bullets at altitude. And Tommy had the capability of, and I'll tell a story later. He was an outstanding aviator, and he was an outstanding engineer. But he also had a very, very interesting and very colorful career. And then Walter Murrett, who was an ex-Marine and had done the Korean War as a Corsair pilot, and as a Mud Marine, as a forward air controller, and was quite a character. For those of you who remember the cartoons, Smitty, he was Smitty because his dad wrote it, and in every way, Walter was he was known as Yogi Bear. Very outstanding pilot. His forte was carry a suit, and none of the Patuxent LSOs really understood how he got the airplane to get all the endpoints on the demonstrations, because he refused to follow signals, but he always got the point. And Walt was outstanding. But we got together on it, and I had done a fair amount of airplane work by this time on the F9, the F11, the S2, A260, and what have you. So we had a pretty good bunch of guys. The airplane, as designed, was a big problem. It was an airplane that had to operate at high altitude at relatively slow speed to do its job as an E2, but it also had to operate by specification from the decks of Essex-class carriers. And the limiting factor here, of course, was the size of the elevators and the size of the hangar bays, and that came up with a set of dimensions that were kind of scary from an engineering standpoint. Said we've got to be pretty smart about this. The Essex-class carrier had the requirements for a relatively short airplane, but yet an airplane that could operate on station in the neighborhood of 30,000 feet and become a very steady platform. And this is where we started. The biggest problem, and it's a problem that dictated the external dimensions of the airplane, was that being able to fit on the elevators of the Essex-class carriers. So this is where the tail came from, and we knew that was going to be one of the biggest problems. The wing had to be a good high altitude wing, and we didn't know what well, I won't say we didn't know. We knew we were going to have to look very carefully at the slow speed characteristics of the airplane. And I chased the first flight on the airplane, and the first flight was flown by Carl Albert, who was an extremely good engineer and an extremely good pilot, a very cautious man. And Tommy was flying the airplane as commander. Carl was his co-pilot. I flew the low altitude in T-28, and Bob Smythe, who had done a lot of F9F work, and he flew in an F9 to do the high altitude chase for the first flight. And I was tucked in too close when they were doing the slow speed stuff. I didn't think so, and neither did anybody else until they did the first power approach and landing configuration stalls, and we found out one of the airplane's problems that we all have lived with down through the years, and that is the fact that it has a very definite and abrupt left roll off at stall. And I was sitting in a position where I had to move a little fast to get out of the way, and I remember it well. And of course, that's one of those things that we have unfortunately had to live with for a long time. There have been some bright lights, but not enough to make us real happy. And I think that we all are aware of this. As we did the testing of the airplane, the number one airplane was an airplane that was set up for basically basic flying qualities, completely instrumented for it. Excuse me. And the number two airplane was going. I had been informed that if I wished to do it, I could do the structural demonstration of the airplane. And I said that's a great idea. So I wound up after the first 10 hours of Carl and Tom doing the basic first 10 hours. That was one of the contracts that was out, and they did that. And then I was the third pilot to get in the airplane because I was going to do the first flight on the number two bird, and that I was going to take that through to all the structural points that had to be made by spec. And I remember very well Carl's comment as he stepped out of the airplane, and I was standing there when he stepped out, and he said, "Well, Dave, it's all yours." And he said, and I got to say, it's got to be one of the worst flying airplanes Grumman ever made. And that was a hell of a comment coming from a contractor's pilot on the first go. We knew we had a big job, and unfortunately, it has turned out to be a big job. However, due to some fixes and some very needed and possible and very needed training, and pulling the teams together, and what the Navy finally wound up with as we see today, and that is a type training situation for the E2 and the C2 that I think does a very reasonable job on an airplane that has been extremely difficult to bring to the fleet and keep to the fleet, but it's been there for how many years now? And I think that's one of the things that happened and happened properly, and that is I think that the training and the work that goes into the E2C2 community is outstanding, and that's a little plug for me because I think it is extremely important.
Dave, can you elucidate a little bit on what it is about the training that was required to mitigate some of these design issues that you talked about?
Okay, and I think that's a very good. It's a very good thing that leads into the early fleet development and the early fleet acquisition of the airplane and getting into it. I think all of us who worked on the airplane realized that, hey, we've got something here that is not exactly what we'd like to see because of what it has to do, and we worked on the airplane's flying qualities concurrently with the same time that we were working on. We've got a system that is going to do things that no airborne system has done before in a sized package that has never been done before. And we had some very sharp people working there. But our development of the first 4 airplanes shows us exactly what was needed. And that was, we must, because of the size of the airplane and because of the cost of the airplane, some of the things that are part of its flying qualities are not as good as they should be until we get the money to take care of it electronically, because we aren't going to be able to take care of it, and we tried very, very hard. We had shapes, we changed flaps. Some interesting stories are there of how we reached the tail configuration. And I was very much wrapped up in that. A short airplane with a lot of power, a requirement, a slow speed requirement for carry operations, both in the end speed off the catapult and a single engine wave off at the stern. And that these were the 2 big things that were required. We have, and I just got into some discussions on that as we're accepting that 1 airplane for our museum, one that came out of the second buy of the airplane. How did we arrive at a tail that looks the way it does and is the whole empennage is 3 fins, 4 fins, but only 3 rudders, and that was tied very much into the single engine controllability of the airplane, with the right engine secured on a wave off, and we had gotten to the biggest rudders we could put on the airplane in the roll and yaw condition for landing, which very definitely told you what the outboard fins and rudders were going to look like. But we tried just doing the single engine work with just the rudders on the 2 outboards. And I remember that very well because I was, Tommy and I were doing it, and I was in the right seat, learning how to fly it. And we did a dynamic single engine wave off in the with the airplane in power approach configuration, right engine secured, full bore on the left, and full right rudder. And the airplane turned like a top to the right, and very, very rapidly. It was a very, very fast break. So we knew we had to do something, and the answer was, okay, let's we knew we had a good situation with the left engine out, and we could still do a proper VMC, but we couldn't do it on the right, and that's why you wound up with a situation where you have three rudders and four fins. And it was a very dramatic flight, and that's another one that I remember very well because I don't like to fly in airplanes that are trying to fly sideways. It sure was.
Dave, I wanted to ask though, when you think about the long lifespan of the E2 and then the C2, you must take a great deal of satisfaction in the engineering decisions and the work that your team made to make it actually work.
Yes, and I do, and my greatest feeling of, gee, I wish we had done better. When we were finished with the airplane, it had gone through, and we're getting ready to deploy it to the fleet. I went with we set up a team of the design engineer, myself as project pilot, and this was specifically for the C2, not so much for the E2 because the E2 was going to squadrons that had received new, strange and wonderful airplanes before. They had been through the E1, and the E1 required quite a bit of additional training because it didn't have the power it needed to do the single engine work that was needed from that design. I did some of the flying on that, and I knew it was that was one of the things that was marginal on the E1. As far as the C2 is concerned, I was very much aware of the way the C1s had been operated, and I had a pretty strong feeling about, hey, we can't let the C2 go to an environment that isn't going to be more technically oriented because of the difference in the airplane. You can get away with an awful lot in the C1 from the standpoint of loading it and flying it. That was pretty good piece of machinery for its time, but when you start comparing it with fleet introduction of the C2, you realize you can't treat this as just another airplane that anybody can get in and go out and do the job. You've got to train people for the job across the board, and I think the accident record of the initial fleet introduction of the C2 proves this beyond a doubt. Things happened back then, and all you have to do is look at the record, and you see things happened that never should have happened and wouldn't have if you had a better training approach to the airplane's introduction to the fleet. And I guess of all the things that I think about as far as the C2 is concerned, that's the one thing that I wish we had been able to do more about earlier. But I think that the way it is set up now, with as tight a group of people as you represent, this is the way to handle something that requires the kind of training that I'm sure you're giving it now, and I wish I wish we had been able to convince more folks way back when, and I think we would have saved a number of airplanes and people.
That's a very profound statement, Dave. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Well, it's something I've lived with for many, many years. I went around the world talking to admirals. We made a big mistake with that team, by the way. We shouldn't have been talking to admirals. We should have been talking to chiefs and maintenance officers, and more of them. But so be it. We learn by doing.
I think this is a good spot to anchor for now, and maybe come back for one more session at least, Dave, to talk about your subsequent efforts.
Well, I think I appreciate that, and I think that one of the things that I would like to have a picture of and show is, I don't know if everybody knows the story of the first 9-plane formation of E2s that ever happened. Does anybody there know anything about that right now?
No.
Well, I think it's worth looking at and having the story of, because it happened, and it was I think it was illegal. I'm not sure.
So, Dave, this is Pence.
Yeah.
When you started with the E2 and C2, how long did it take before you went to the fleet squadrons?
Well, with the C2, I first flew it in '64, and it didn't go to the fleet until '56, I believe. And with the E2, we started it that was November. That was the fall of 50. Well, I know that we had 3, and I've got all that data in my books. I can come up with it, but I'll bring it to you the next time we talk. But
Thanks.
you had somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 years on the E2, from first flight to first fleet indoctrination, and you had 3 NPEs on the E2, and you basically only had 1 NPE on the C2. But you had a lot of Patuxent flying on it at the same time. But that one was watched pretty carefully because of events that occurred.
Dave, for those of our audience who are not aviation savvy, what does NPE stand for?
Navy Preliminary Evaluation.
Thanks.
And that's when a team from Patuxent goes over the airplane, and that initially that was something that was watched very closely, also overseen by the Board of Inspection and Survey, BIS, and BIS doesn't enter into it anymore. I don't believe. I think that's all been pulled back into an Aviator. But things were different. The gestation period for the E2 was longer than the C2, and there was some basic mistakes made. That we can talk offline on that to see how much you want to include. But that was the main reason that I feel you had the fatalities and you had the accidents early on in the C2 world, because because of the way things were done. And read Admiral Dunn's report on NATOPS when he came back in and really put it on the line as far as squadron to squadron training, and the fact that hey, we can't live that way anymore. We've got to change it.
Okay, I'm going to say let's call it a day for today's session. We've done 3 interviews with, against his will, I'm going to say, legendary test pilot Dave Seeman from Grumman, also a great Navy veteran.
Which can I do a job of letting you know what that legend is?
Dave, the fact that you were there at the beginning and you're still here, that makes you a legend to all of us.
All right.
This has been great. We're going to do it, I think, several more to kind of continue on. We're only up to the late 50s at this point. There's a lot more of the story to tell.